Hello and welcome back to the channel. In this video, we're going to be learning about overloading and polymorphism in Java. First, let's look at a couple of shapes. This is a triangle. It's a shape. And this is also a shape. It's a rectangle. This is a circle. It's also a shape. Now, even though I'm using different names for all these shapes, they are still shapes. Now, the whole idea of this example is to explain polymorphism. Polymorphism is basically when you express something in multiple forms. In this case, I'm expressing the idea of a shape as multiple different kinds of shapes. So I could express a shape as a triangle, a rectangle, or a circle. All of them are shapes. Now, polymorphism is what forms the basis for method overloading. But before we understand what exactly method overloading is, we'll look at a program. Right, so I made a program which contains two classes, shapes and overloader. Now my shapes class just has a few methods and a few variables that's regarding shapes. So it has a instance variable to store the area of a shape. I also made a method to calculate the area of a rectangle, as you can see. Now let's say I want to add another method to calculate the area of a triangle. Now let me just add that method. So I added the method to calculate the area of a triangle, but there is an issue. There is an error. Now the main error here is both the methods have the same name. Now why is this an error? Because let's say I call this method in my main public class. In my main method, I create an object for my shapes and I call this method. And Java is going to go to my shapes class. It's going to search for that method and it's going to call that method, right? But it has two methods. Both methods have two parameters. Both parameters are integers. It is impossible for the computer to decide to choose a certain method. This is a compile time error. As you can see, the compiler highlights this line because it's just telling us that this is an error. It's a syntax error. I need to change this. Now, one thing I could do is I can just change the name of the method. I can just call this area rect. So this would just be the area of a rectangle and this would be area tri for a triangle. And this would work because now when I call area rect, it would search for the for this particular method and it would call this particular method. If I want to find the area of a triangle and I could call this method, it's going to search and it's going to call this method. But that gets really confusing because as a user, I would have to remember the names of so many methods, rectangles, triangles, circles. There are so many shapes out there. So instead what we can do is we can use method overloading. So method overloading uses polymorphism. And it's pretty simple to understand if you apply the same definition. We know that polymorphism is when I apply one thing in multiple forms, such as a shape in multiple different kinds of shapes. In the same way, I use a particular name of the method and I express that name for multiple purposes. It's pretty simple. In the context of this program, method overloading is basically expressing this method area in multiple forms, just creating multiple methods with the same name. Now we know that this doesn't work. It didn't work here. But Java does allow us to differentiate two methods with the same name for method overloading. So there are three ways we can use method overloading. We can use the order of the parameters, the number of the parameters, as well as the types of the parameters. Let's look at the same program. So the first way to use method overloading is by changing the number of parameters. In this case, I have two methods and it's obviously causing an error because both methods have the same name and the same number of parameters. What I'll do is I'll change the number of parameters for one method. So what we'll do is let's just remove this breadth. Let's remove it over here as well. So now I'm just taking in a value, which is the length, and I'm setting my area as the length, and I'm returning the area, which is just the length of the shape, or whatever shape it is. But now you see that I'm using the same name. I'm using the name area, but I don't get any error because the number of parameters for both methods is different. In my public method or public class, if I call this method, a certain method is called depending on the number of parameters. So let's say I call my area method, but I input only one value, one parameter. Java looks for that method with that name with one value. Both methods have the same name, but only this method has that name area and takes in only one parameter. So it calls this method. It's just an opportunity for the compiler to differentiate two different methods having the same name but different number of parameters. But to make this program more practically applicable, let's change this method to take the radius as input so that we can calculate the area of a circle. So we'll just say this is a radius and my area would be 3.14 times the radius square. Right, so now this is returning the area of a circle, this is returning the area of a triangle. Depending on what input the user gives, it can call a certain method. It's much more easier to use my program. Now let me add the original method to calculate the area of the rectangle. Right, so this method isn't working because both of them have the same name and the same number of parameters. Now I can't really change the number of parameters here. A rectangle does have two sides that I need to calculate the area of the rectangle, and I need to know two sides or two values to calculate the area of a triangle. So I can't change the number of parameters, but I can also use the data types of the parameters or the order of the parameters. Now here you can see that both parameters are integers, and here both parameters are again integers. What I could do is change the data type of one of these parameters. So let's just make this a double. And you see our problem is resolved. Now the program doesn't show any error because this method is not really the same as this method. The name is the same, the number of parameters is the same, but the types of parameters is different. This has two integers and this has a double and an integer. Basically, if I call an area method and I give it a double value and an integer value, it's going to call this method. But if I give it an integer value and another integer value, it's going to call this method. And this is really useful. I can now use the same name for two different methods calculating the area of two different shapes. Now, what if I also set this to a double? Well, obviously there's going to be an error. Both of them have the same data types, both of them have the same names, Java cannot differentiate them, there is no overloading, it's going to be an error. To escape this, I could also change the order in which I type the parameters. So I could instead make this int breadth and double length. Now again, both of them have the same parameters. Both parameters or all parameters have the same data types. Both methods have the same names, but there is no error because the order in which you write the parameters is different. Calling the area method with a double value first and an integer value next is different from calling an area method with an integer value first and a double value next. Since the order of the parameters is different, depending on the order in which you call the method or the order in which you call the parameters, one of these methods is going to get called. And that's one of the other ways you can use method overloading in Java. So now let's actually just call these methods and test out our program. So first, let me just create an object for the shapes class. Right. So we don't really have a constructor, and if you watch my previous video, you will know that Java already created a default constructor over here that's giving my area variable a default value. Right, so now that I made my object, let's call each of these methods and see what happens. So let's just call obj.area and let's give it only one value, 3. Now when I call it, Java is going to go into my shapes class. It's going to look for the method with the name area. There are 3 methods with that name, but there is only one method that's taking in one parameter. So it's going to call this method. So let's just print this out and see what happens. Right. And now we see that we get a double value. Java called the method I asked for. Now let's just change this. Let's give it an integer value and then a double value. So 3 and 4.0. So when you look at this, well, there are 2 methods with 2 parameters, but only one method with this particular order. I'm using the order of the parameters. There is only one area method that's taking in an integer value and then a double value. So when I call this, I should get 12.0. And as you can see, that is what we get. We get 12.0. Now let's change the order again. Let's make this a double. 3.0 and 4. Now Java is going to go into my shapes class and there is only one method with this particular order. A double value first and an integer value next. Even though all 3 have the same name, it's going to call this particular method. So I should get 6.0 now, and that is what we get. So that's it. That's method overloading in Java. I really hope you like this video. In the next video, we're going to be looking at constructor overloading. Thank you and have a great day.